So, welcome everybody. Stephen's now joined. Martin, welcome as well. Terry, good to see you as well. Jackie, Andrew. So, today we are learning the last three of the 39 melachot. The last three of the 39 forms of labor. And it's almost, let's say, two halves of the chapter. Somewhat disconnected, but the Rambam puts them in together. So let's jump right in. I'm going to give you a little bit of a, it's interesting. Halacha can be very dry when you learn it on its own, but when you understand the spiritual side of it, there's an incredible depth. So we have a lot of material to cover in the halacha, but I do want to share a little bit of the beautiful teachings that I learned. So let's just learn this first halacha, and then I'll share with you something very special that I remember hearing over 30 years ago. Okay, so we begin. Chapter 12. A person who kindles even the smallest fire is liable, provided he needs the ash that it creates. Now, interestingly, you'll notice at the end of the halacha, the Rambam will talk about the more obvious benefit of fire, which is the heat and light that it creates. But here we're talking about a more, if you could call it, primitive benefit of fire, which is the benefit that comes from that which you're burning. So whether it's ash or coal that you're creating. However, should a person kindle a fire with a destructive intent, he is not liable for he is causing ruin. Okay, so what we're saying basically is this fire has two benefits that it brings. Number one, it produces either ash or coal, etc., and it produces heat and warmth. Now, what we're saying is that in benefit number one, if I just want to get rid of something, if I want to ruin something, there's no benefit of benefit number one. We're going to get to benefit number two at the end of the halacha. This sentence that begins similarly, that's benefit number two, warmth to light. Now we're talking in terms of benefit from destroying. He says that no, if you're just ruining, because ruining is not a form of malacha. However, nevertheless, a person who sets fire to a heap of produce or a dwelling belonging to a colleague is liable. If you're doing it because you want to burn down your neighbor's house, then it is a malacha. Why? Because his intent is to take revenge on his enemies. Through this act, he's calming his feeling and venting his rage. He is comparable to a person who tragically rends his garments over a deceased person or enraged on the Shabbos, or a person who injures a colleague in an argument. These individuals are all considered to be performing a constructive activity because of their evil inclinations. So a person who wants to do something evil with his fire, then because he's allowed himself to calm down by taking revenge on his neighbor, then it's considered an act that's generated benefit. Similarly, a person who lights a candle or wood, now that Rambam goes into the other after halacha, a person who lights a candle or wood, whether to generate warmth or light, is liable. A person who heats iron in order to strengthen it by submerging it in water is also liable for performing a derivative of the forbidden labor of kindling. Okay. Now, interestingly, you'll notice that around other metals, the Rambam did say that in a previous chapter, the issue would have been around cooking, but here the Rambam is saying because of kindling. But I want to now share with you something interesting around this halacha, and that is from something which the Rebbe taught. It was the first yard site after his wife had passed away. And the Rebbe, we know, was a deeply private person and never shared, not never, but rarely would he share his personal feelings in terms of as a within his family, etc., especially about his wife. But on that first yard site, the Rebbe was speaking, about the tragedy of having lost someone who was so close to him throughout his entire life, and such a righteous tzaddikus as the Rebbetzin was. And that day of the yard site was this day's Rambam. And the Rebbe spoke about this halacha. And he said, what's the lesson here? He said, it's talking here about when a fire is put out. Now we think of, before we get to the detail of the lesson, we think of the activities which are forbidden on Shabbos as a bad thing, right? It's forbidden to talk Lashon Hara. Why? It's bad. It's forbidden to eat chazer. Why? It's bad. So it's forbidden to extinguish a fire on Shabbos because it's bad. But it's different, because think about it. Where does the prohibition derive from? When something is prohibited on Shabbos, where does it tell you its original source was? How were we as the Jewish people first introduced to that form of labor? In which context?
Mishkan.
The Mishkan. Is building the Mishkan a good thing? Of course. Obviously only for 6 days a week. But when halacha tells you that an act, and it describes an act as being prohibited on Shabbos, it's also telling you something very positive, that this act is a form of creating a home for Hashem. So what does the Rambam say here in this halacha? He says, Hamavir eish kol shu chayiv, that a person who extinguishes even the smallest fire, the smallest spark, if you extinguish it, you're liable. In other words, you've performed an act which would have been useful in the creation of a home for Hashem. On one condition, as long as there's some substantial benefit, some drop of ash that comes out of it. He said, what's the lesson here? He says, what does Aish mean in the depths of Torah? What is the ultimate fire? Kiner Hashem Nishmas Adam, right? The soul of man. He says, when an Aish is put out, any neshama, when a neshama is extinguished from the world, what would our thought have been? What would our thought have been? Our thought would have been that it's prohibited. Why is it prohibited? It's prohibited because it's our thought would be that it's a negative. Why is it a negative? Because a neshama is being lost, and a neshama being lost is a bad thing. Comes halacha and says no, that the passing of a neshama, the soul that's being lost, he says it's sorry about that. It's a positive act. Why? Meaning, when is the passing of a holy person or any neshama a form of creating a home for Hashem? If some bit of ash comes out of it. What's ash relative to fire? Fire is transcendent. Fire burns. Fire elevates. Ash is cold and hard. What's the halacha telling us? That when does the act become meaningful? If something substantial comes out of it. And so he said, we're consumed now with this loss of someone so close to us, this fire that's burnt. He said, that's been extinguished, He says, if something substantial comes out of it, then the pain, the sorrow, the loss has meaning in our purpose of creating a home for Hashem. It's just one example of how halacha also has so much more, so much more spiritual purpose to it. Okay, halacha beis. A person who extinguishes a fire, even of the smallest size, is liable. So halacha number 37 was hamavir, which is the malacha of kindling a fire. Of kindling a fire. Malacha number 38 is mechabe, a separate issue, which is extinguishing. Whether he extinguishes a candle or a coal that comes from wood. In contrast, the person who extinguishes a glowing piece of metal is not liable. Just to point out that there is a contentious issue in halacha. According to some, it is. Again, just as a reminder, everything which the Rambam says here, you're not liable, what it means is that if witnesses would watch a person doing it and warn him, and there was a Sanhedrin, a person's not liable for capital punishment. But it's not permitted at all. Unless the Rambam says it's permitted, it's not permitted. It's still prohibited. The person's just not liable for capital punishment. So it's important to always, I'm sorry if you've gotten that reminder a few times in Hilchos Shabbos, and the Rambam, of course, writes it very clearly in chapter 1, but it's important to always remember that when the Rambam says something, you're not liable for it, he's not saying you're allowed to do it. Sorry, back into the halacha. If, however, the person's intent is to purify the metal, he is liable for extinguishing it. This indeed is the practice of blacksmiths. They heat the iron until it glows like a coal and extinguish it in water to seal it. This is the process of purification for which one is liable. It is derivative of the category of forbidden labor of extinguishing. It is permissible to extinguish a glowing piece of metal in the public domain so that many people will not be injured by it. Now, again, this is according to the Rambam, who has a more stringent view. According to the other halachic authorities, even a glowing piece of wood you'd be allowed to extinguish, according to the Shulchan Aruch. If it's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa, so it's because you're not liable. If it's in a dangerous place, you can. A person who pours oil into a burning lamp is liable for kindling, and similarly, a person who takes oil from a lamp is liable for extinguishing. Halacha Gimel. Should a fire break out on Shabbos? This is a very interesting halacha. A person is liable if he extinguishes it because of fear of monetary loss. So, in principle, in halacha, if a candle falls on the table on Shabbos, what do I need to do? Run out of the house, full stop. It is only, I'm not allowed to run and get water. It is only the threat of loss of life and not monetary loss that supersedes the Shabbos prohibitions. Therefore, all people should leave the area of the blaze so that they do not die. They should let the fire continue to burn even if it consumes the entire city. So loss of monetary value, monetary possessions alone are not enough. Now, the Ramah writes in Shulchan Aruch that you, because of the potential of the fire spreading and putting lives in danger, you would be allowed to do it. However, the danger that he's referring to is that when there was a fire in the Jewish sections of the city, it was often a time to get a pogrom going. Nevertheless, most halachic authorities say that today, the way houses are built in such close proximity to each other, where there's a tree, etc., and it's very easy for a fire to go from one place to another, you are allowed to. If, however, let's say I'm out in the bush, a standalone cabin, there's nothing near me. It's just me and my brother. We went for a Shabbos alone, some time out. I'm not allowed to put out the fire on for a monetary basis alone. Halacha Daled. It is permissible to construct a barrier using any type of container, whether full or empty, so that the fire will not spread. So you can put things up. You may even construct a barrier using earthen vessels filled with water, although they will surely break and extinguish the fire. In other words, it's permissible to cause a fire to be extinguished indirectly. And then he says something else. One may place a bowl over a candle so that the light will not catch on the beams of the roof. However, what he's saying there is obviously a bowl that has ventilation. So you're not allowed to put a bowl over a candle to put the candle out, suffocating it from oxygen. Halacha hey, when a fire catches onto a perfume box, a chest, or a wooden cabinet, one bring goat skin or another substance will not catch fire and spread it over the portion that has not been consumed, so that the fire will not reach there. Rambam explains elsewhere that goat skin would, generally speaking, not catch fire. Sure, interesting. Yeah, it is. Thank you. Halacha Vav. When a garment that is folded catches on fire, one may spread it out, don it. If in the process the fire is extinguished, it's not significant. Similarly, if a Torah scroll is caught on fire, one may unroll it and read from it. If in the process the fire is extinguished, again, it's not significant. One may place water on the portion that has not yet caught fire. If in the process the fire is extinguished, it is not significant. Again, the commentators that Rambam explain what the advantages to each of the examples. If a person left a burning candle on the board, one may shake the board, causing the candle to fall. If it is extinguished, again, it is not significant. Aval, if he intentionally placed it down before nightfall, it is forbidden to move the board even after the candle is extinguished. This is a separate halacha, which we'll learn more about in the laws of muktzah. That's something which I was not allowed to move when Shabbos came in. I am not allowed to move even once the candles are out. So, for example, on your Shabbos table, if when you light the Shabbos candles, the candles are alone on the table, you are not allowed to shake that table the whole Shabbos, even after the candles go out. Why? Because it was a table just to candles. The chalos should be on the table as well. So you should never have a surface that has only muktzah things on it. Zayin, Nachri Shabbat. If I broke on Shabbos and a Gentile comes to extinguish it, you may not even tell him to extinguish it. Nor must we tell him, do not extinguish it, for his resting is not our responsibility. This is probably the most ignored halacha in all of Hilchos Shabbos, the prohibition. You are not allowed to tell a Gentile, or even hint to a Gentile to do malacha for you on Shabbos, do a prohibited labor. We'll see soon. In a case of a fire, you're allowed to say, I will say in a second, conscious should a child desire to extinguish the fire, he should not be allowed to do it if he's acting on the father's behalf. In other words, children are considered an extension of the adult in terms of the observance of the laws of Shabbos. As it says in the mitzvah of Shabbos, Ata bincho bitecha avdach v'maschu, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant. If he is acting as an initiative, the court is not obligated to restrain him. And lastly, in the instance of a fire, our sages permitted a person to say, anyone who extinguishes the fire will not suffer a loss. In other words, you're allowed to encourage a non-Jew to feel comfortable to put it out. But again, as we'll learn in more detail, you're not allowed to ask non-Jews or even hint to a non-Jew to do work for us. That's the first half of the halacha. Any questions, quickly, of the chapter? We're going to leave fire now and go into the next. All good? Okay.
All good, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good.
Rabbi, sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
What if you, before Shabbos comes in, if you mention to somebody that you would like something done during Shabbos, and you've asked them before Shabbos starts, and then they do that for you, is that accepted? Something that you wouldn't normally be allowed to do.
So,
let's say like turning a light out on their way out.
So anything which is for your benefit, you even have to stop them from doing it. Even if you don't even tell them to do it. Okay? If it's for their benefit, for example, if they're living in the house with you and they come into the room and they put on the light and you happen to be sitting there, you don't have to leave the room. But otherwise, if it's just for you, then no.
Okay, thank you.
But then, you know what? It's those laws are very, very detailed, and they'll receive a much fuller treatment in the time to come.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
All good. Okay, this is a malacha number 39, which is transferring objects from one domain to another. It's the 39th of the forbidden forms of labor. Although this prohibition, as all the elements of the body of Torah, was communicated orally by Moshe, meaning the 39 malachot were not told, as he received them from Sinai. It's alluded to in the Torah itself. Why? Because when it came to building the Mishkan, it said, when they finished everything, he said, no man or woman should do any further work concerning the donations to the sanctuary. And it says, what did they stop doing? They stopped bringing their gifts. From this, one can infer that bringing an article from one domain to another is also referred to as labor. So carrying my sitter to shul on Shabbos is breaking Shabbos on an equal level as driving to the shop. Carrying is so small. But here you see what was the labor they stopped doing? They stopped bringing gifts. So carrying is a primary and very powerful foundational form of the mitzvahs of Shabbos. And if we have a minute when we're finished, I'll explain you some of the spiritual side of the beautiful spiritual side of that as well. But I want to first get through the content of the halacha. Similarly, I've learned according to the oral tradition that a person who carries an article from the beginning of 4 square cubits to the end of that square is comparable to a person who transfers an article from one domain to another and is liable. Okay, so now what we're saying is like this. The Isra of Heitzah is 2 things of carrying. It's either carrying to or from the public domain to the private domain, or carrying within the public domain 4 cubits, which is approximately 2 meters. Okay? However, again, and that's prohibited under any condition, obviously, unless there's an Eruv. However, there are 3 conditions necessary. A person who transfers an object from one domain to another is not liable until 1, he transfers an object of sufficient size, so he's only liable if it's sufficient size to be useful, from a private domain to a public domain, okay, or a public domain to a private domain. So it has to be useful. It has to be, meaning it can't be, if I carry it from my property to my neighbor's property, obviously that's still prohibited, but it's not this primary malacha. And number 3, I have to lift it, I have to remove it from one domain and place it down in the other domain. Okay? A person is not liable if he merely removed the article and did not place it down. And another person took it from his hand and placed it down. Okay, so if I walk outside and someone takes it from my hand, again, it's prohibited, but it's not liable. Or I placed it down in the private domain, but I didn't remove it originally from the public. Or I transferred a less than amount that is useful. So just to point out, if chas v'shalom, a person is walking home and remembers suddenly they have something in their pocket, don't stop. Because stopping would be considered carrying in the public domain. Rather keep walking and allow it to slip out of your pocket. Because stopping would complete the labor. So again, I obviously have still broken Shabbos, but I'm lessening the severity of the break by not putting it down or stopping in the public domain. Similarly, a person who carries an article from the beginning of the fair square 4 cubits to the end of that square in the public domain is not liable unless he removes an article, again, of significant side from one side of the square and places down the other side of the square 4 cubits. So just like it's necessary from one to the other, same thing is within the public domain itself. Yod, a person who throws an article from one domain to another or who hands an article from one domain to another is liable for performing a derivative of the forbidden labor. Okay, so there's the av and there's the tulda. There's the primary malacha, and there are the derivatives, which are also biblical prohibitions. Okay, so if I throw it from my house to the street, it's prohibited. Similarly, a person who throws or passes an article by hand from the beginning of the fair square cubit to the end is also liable for performing a derivative of transferring. A person who throws in an abnormal manner is not liable. Okay, so if I throw it with my mouth or other things like we'll see later in 2 halachas from now, then it's not it's not liable. Again, prohibited, not liable. Yud Aleph, a person who transfers part of an object from one of these domains, of private or public, to the other is not liable until he transfers the entire object from one domain into the other. For example, if a container is filled with articles, even if it's filled with mustard seed, meaning small things, and a person transferred the majority of it from one domain to the other, the person is not liable unless he transfers the entire container. Okay? So again, it's prohibited, but not liable if I only take a part of something. The same applies in other similar situations. The rationale is that the container causes all the articles within it to be considered a single entity. So if I've removed part of an entity, I'm not liable, although prohibited. Now, where does this next halacha come into play? For example, if I am bringing medicine to a sick person who needs it, their life is in danger, I should do it in a way that doesn't break Shabbos as much. So, for example, a person who transfers an article in the ordinary fashion, which the article is considered liable, whether he transferred it by his right hand and his left hand or in his bosom, whether he transferred the money bound up in a cloth, you're liable in all these cases. Doesn't matter if I'm a righty and I put it in my left hand, or lefty in my right hand. Similarly, if I put it on my shoulder, this applies. The article is more than 10 breaths high in the public domain, because if you remember that 40 inches, which is about a meter high, is already considered out of the air zone of the public domain. But this is still considered carrying, because that's the way the sons of Kahas would carry the articles in the sanctuary, above 10 breaths high. So it doesn't matter if I'm carrying it above 10 meters of the ground, I'm liable in all these situations, as it says they should carry them on their shoulders, as mentioned. All the obligations of Shabbos are derived from the sanctuary, and the sanctuary they would carry even if it's higher. In contrast, a person is not liable when transferring an article on the back of his hand. Okay, so if I put it over here and I carry it, so if I carry this yahrzeit candle like this, again, it's prohibited, but I'm not liable. Okay, in his mouth, in the crook of his arm, in his ear, in a pocket under his garment, the opening of the garment is facing downward, between one garment and another, not meaning in the folds, in the hems, in his shoes, in his sandals. The rationale is they didn't transfer the articles as people usually do. So because I do it in an abnormal manner, the level of a transgression is lessened somewhat. The following rules apply when a person transfers a burden carrying it on his head. If the burden was heavy, another example given, a full sack, a chest, a cabinet, or the like, and the person places it on his head and holds it with his hand, he is liable. This is the normal manner in which these articles are transferred, and this is thus equivalent to a person carrying an article on his shoulder or his hand. If, however, a person placed a light article, a garment, a book, or knife on his head and transferred them without holding them in his hand, he is not liable. Why? Because he did not transfer them in the ordinary manner. For post, people do not transfer articles by placing them on their heads. Now, I would imagine that, for example, in South Africa, where there's a more common way of carrying, it would be different. A person who carries an article from the beginning of a square 4 cubits long to the end of that square in the public domain is liable, even when he lifts it above his head. Okay. Mutter la'adam, it is permissible for a person to move objects in the public within a square 4 cubits adjacent to the place where he is standing. He is allowed to move articles freely throughout this square. Okay, these cubits are measured according to the size of the person's arm. If ever his arms are dwarf size, he's granted 4 cubits according to the size of an average person's arms, according to the oral tradition. So in other words, if I'm out in public and I'm stuck there and I'm holding something, I can walk around within those 2 meters, square 2 meters. This is the interpretation of the Torah statement. Every person should remain in his place. In other words, that every person should not move an article outside the square, only within it. This square represents the length of a human body. When one extends one's hand and feet, only within it is one allowed to move objects. Tes Zayin. When 2 people are standing near each other, and a portion of the few cubits in which may one extend extends into 4 cubits, they may both bring food and eat in the center, provided one does not take something from the area which is solely his and bring it into the area which is solely his colleagues. Okay? If 3 people are standing near each other and the middle of the individual space is enclosed within their space, he is permitted to share with them and they are permitted to share with him. The 2 individuals on the extremes, however, are forbidden to share with each other. So this middle guy can take from either guy because their 2 square meters are extending, but the 2 on the outside aren't allowed to. And here the Rambam talks about something which is permitted. Again, it should only be used under extreme circumstances, but it is permitted. Based on the above, it is permitted for a person to lift up an article from the public domain and give it to a colleague who is near him within his 4 cubits. The colleague may give it to another colleague standing at his side, who may pass it further, even if the article changes hands hundreds of times or is transferred several kilometers on the Shabbos. Is permissible because each individual moved it only within the 4 cubits granted to him. Since each person is allowed to carry within a square 4 cubits by 4 cubits, he's permitted to carry along the diagonal of the square, which is 5 3/5 cubits long. So accordingly, a person who carries or throws an article in public domain is not liable unless he moves it beyond 5 3/5 cubits from its original place. So that's how long you can actually move. Now, whenever we have mentioned from the beginning to the end, from the beginning of the square 4 cubits long to the end of the square, or one who carries objects 4 cubits liable, the intent was the distance from the beginning of the diagonal of 4 cubits to the end. So if a person carries an object for a shorter distance, it's not liable. So you actually have 5 3/5 cubits because you have that space in that direction to carry. Thus, the Rambam concludes the first element of these halachas of the chapter. There are 3 levels of responsibility that apply when a person lifts up an object from one place in the public domain and places it in another public domain. If there are less than 4 cubits between these 2 places, the act is permitted. So if I'm standing in the middle of the street and I pick up something and I walk 3 cubits, 100% permitted. If there are more than 4 cubits, but less than 5 3/5 cubits between the 2 places, the act is forbidden, but the person is not liable. If there are more than 5 3/5 cubits, the person is liable because it moved an article beyond the diagonal of a square 4 cubits long, and then he would be chayiv. You have time for a quick thought, quick vart on it. You can share it at your Shabbos project table tonight. Why is it? This is Melacha number 39. Now, there are still many, many more chapters. There's another 18 chapters left of Hilchos Shabbos explaining all of these Melachas. But the Melacha of carrying into the public domain or carrying within the public domain itself, from the private to the public or within the public itself, is a central Melacha of Shabbos, and it's one of the only Melachas that are hinted to in the Pasuk. Why is it so fundamental to Shabbos? And when you think about basic Shabbos observance, it's so, what's today considered a Shabbos observant community is what? When you have an Eruv. Bloberg is still applying for platinum Shabbat service status. We're not there yet, right? Why is carrying so central? Because what does it mean, a public domain? The Gemara tells us that there's only one Yachid in the world, private. What does private mean? Private means it's my property. This property is mine. Is it really mine? No. In other words, the idea of there being separate properties, this is mine, this is yours, this is someone else's, and then there is a domain that belongs to the many. No, that's not Shabbos. Shabbos is about one idea. Hashem Echad. There is only one God. And in truth, the entire universe is a Reshus HaYachid, is a private domain to what? To Yechidai Shalaylam. It's private to the oneness of God. The entire universe is God's personal space. So the concept of a public domain, a domain that belongs to the many, is contrary to the whole theme of Shabbos. Shabbos in and of itself is what? Shabbos is about oneness. All week long, we live in a broken world, a world that belongs to many, many different agendas, many ideas, many purposes or drives, not only because of the many people around us, but inside my own little head. My head is cluttered all week long. I have an ego, I have anger, I have jealousy, I have depression, I have addiction, I have everything. Comes Shabbos, no. Shabbos, I have one agenda. Shabbos is Hashem Echad. Shabbos, I belong to Hashem alone. So the idea of taking something out of the private domain and into the public domain, or carrying something within the public domain, runs contrary to the whole concept of Shabbos. Shabbos is what? Shabbos is Reshus HaYachid. Now, especially for all of you who are going to be spending Shabbos at home this week, if you're not going to be going out at all, I mean, I'm going to be walking to Shul, but don't feel bad that you're spending Shabbos at home, because that's the ultimate form of keeping Shabbos. I wish you all a very, very special Shabbos project Shalom, and good to be spending it with you. Any questions? Kent?
Rabbi, does that mean that if you mistakenly walk out of your home and you find within 2 steps of your gate that you've got a chocolate in your pocket, and you take it out and leave it where you stand and carry on without performing a malacha?
Well, you've already performed part of the malacha by carrying it out of the public domain, but minimize the transgression by not stopping, not taking it out of your pocket and putting it down, because that would complete. If you remember, you have to do akira and hanacha. Akira is removing it, and hanacha is placing it. So if you would take the chocolate out of your pocket and put it down, you would be completing the malacha by hanacha, by putting it down. So rather, sort of let it fall out of your pocket as you're walking.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Have a beautiful Shabbos, everyone. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good Shabbos,
Thanks,
everybody.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shabbos Shabbat.